In true Jeanette Winterson style, it is not the cosy sitting round a fire, chatting with other academics version of the story that is commonly told, set to make his fortune with a new generation of sex dolls for lonely men everywhere.
Lair, Dracula, what's it called? Dracula's just house, wherever Dracula is set. I now suddenly cannot remember.
Yeah, so there's just so many questions. We're starting another reading vlog. We're starting another one, and this one is for Frankissstein. And this one begins, so I have started it, it begins with Mary Shelley in the Italian lakes, getting the inspiration for writing Frankissstein, which was published in 1818. In true Jeanette Winterson style, it is not the cosy sitting round a fire, chatting with other academics version of the story that is commonly told. It is much more of a like sexually liberal environment in which the inspiration is brought forward. I have realised that I'm quite fascinated by these people who take an interesting book and then write a story that revolves around how that book or that author was writing at the time. So another book that's on my TBR that I want to read really soon is Eden by Sonia Overall, and this one is based on Ernest Hemingway writing The Garden of Eden, which is a book that that was published posthumously, so he hadn't actually quite finished writing it when he died. But I read that recently and absolutely loved the book. And then this one is based on him writing it, but then blends it with other characters, and then like intertwines them, as far as I know. And I think that is basically what's happening here. Because, yeah, we started with Mary Shelley getting her inspiration for Frankissstein, and then we've moved to present day. It doesn't give a very specific date, but it does say on the back, as Brexit grips Britain. So I'm going to assume it's supposed to be very much contemporary to 2019. And we're following a young transgender doctor, Rye, who's travelled to Memphis to attend a robotics and AI convention thing. And specifically he's going to interview or something Ron Lord, who is set to make his fortune with a new generation of sex dolls for lonely men everywhere. Yeah, so that I've literally just started this. We're at page 30. I've read 2 Jeanette Wintersons before, that's why this was on my radar, but happily it was also a Booker long list. So, you know, as someone who is becoming interested in the Booker prize, that's brilliant. But I've read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, that was one of my favourite books from last year, and then this year I read Sexing the Cherry, which is absolutely chaotic and crazy. I gave that one a 4-star. It's not one of my favourite books. It's very difficult to read because it's so chaotic. But I'm keeping it, and I would like to go back and sort of study it, because I think what Jeanette Winterson was trying to do with it was very interesting. It's not a very enjoyable read. Like, it's not a great story. Whereas this, a bit like Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, is looking set to be like an actually interesting story to read. So I'm hoping this is going to be a new favourite, but not enough has happened for me to really update you very much yet. So I'll speak to you soon.
Winterson. I love this book. I would describe this as like a Russian doll of a book. There are so many layers to it. So like the first one is very obvious. It feels very in your face, this idea that she is comparing the writing of Frankissstein to modern day like AI development. The characters are like, they have the same name in the present, but like versions of the characters that are in the older one. So we have Mary Shelley, and then we have Rye, but that's transgender, but the name comes from Mary, but it's Rye. So this whole thing is just conversations that are being had. So in the past, so the 1818 section or 1817 section, it's all conversations being had in this remote setting in the Italian lakes, where Mary Shelley famously wrote Frankissstein, sorry. And then in the sort of present day section, it's all conversations happening between Rye and Professor Victor Stein, Rye and the interviewer, Rye and people he encounters. There's like interview sections, and there's just like all these snippets of conversations happening. And so it's very much about people discussing their opinions on man-made, nature-made, born, made, like all these different things. And so there's like that surface level of like the main Russian doll. And then as you peel it away, there's loads of other bits. So there are references to other classic literature, such as Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then there are like slight allusions to it. So like Professor Stein takes Rye down into some underground lab underneath Manchester. And then there's like this section. And as I was reading it, I was like, that really reminds me of the description of Dracula's lair, what's it called? Dracula's just house in wherever Dracula is set. I now suddenly cannot remember. But anyway, like there's just like that. There's like all these things that you just can pick out, and then there are questions of God and how would we be happier without all this extra knowledge. And there are just there are so many layers and so many things, and I can't even describe them all. I don't even have the thought process right now to describe them and talk about them, but I'm just loving it. And I just think, again, I've mentioned it about so many books lately. I think I'm just having a real winner of a time with books at the moment, but I need to own a copy of this so I can annotate it, because there is so much to think about. It is just so layered and so phenomenal, and it's also so readable. Like, it's not dry with having all those layers. I think sometimes when so much goes into a book, it can then become a bit of a slog, whereas at least so far, at least by the halfway point, this is so readable. Look, it's Mia drinking again. She likes to do that when I'm filming. I'll check in with you at the end. It's finished. I finished Frankissstein. This has cemented itself as first place so far on my list of Jeanette Winterson books that I've read. There's that question, isn't there, that people often ask, like, if you could invite anyone to a dinner party, fictional, non-fiction, you know, real or imagined people, like, if you could invite anyone, who would you invite? Jeanette Winterson. I think she's a thoroughly interesting person. Like, the level of connections and thought processes and philosophical questions and psychological questions that went into this book, the history, the art history, the literature that got sort of cross-referenced is amazing. This is like one of the best books I think I've ever read. I do think that this is going to go on my list of best books ever. I think it's quite in your face. I think there are going to be many people that don't enjoy this because it's quite... This is what I was saying before. It feels like Russian dolls. Like, there's that like surface level of man-made creations and AI and uploading our brains into some sort of software that's like this really in-your-face discussion on the surface of it all. And then from that, we have all these extra layers that are coming in. But it's done just so brilliantly. It's so interesting. But I can see that in-your-faceness would be off-putting to some readers. Like, if you're the sort of person who likes, say, a Lisa Jewell thriller, or, I don't know, like a Philippa Gregory historical novel, which I used to love a Philippa Gregory. I don't so much anymore, but those sorts of readers are not the sorts of readers that are going to like this. But I think if you love allusions to other pieces of literature, allusions to different parts of history, speculation on how different things were created and all of that, I think this is just phenomenal. So the three books that I've read of Jeanette Winterson's, the first one was Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. And that one very much has a storyline that you're following. It has some elements of mythology woven in. So there's like, every now and then there'll be a cutaway to
a mythological story. So just like a small section, and then you'll come back to your main narrative. And then the second one I read was Sexing the Cherry, which is so chaotic and so crazy. And then very near the end, like I think it's in like the last 20 pages, you get this like it's like a paragraph. It's nothing, but it suddenly makes sense of everything that you've read so far, and then you get sort of thrown back into the chaoticness. But that one paragraph makes sense of everything that's happened before. And I think this is like a nice medium between the two, where you've got the fiction and the non-fiction intertwining. There's elements of fantasy and magical realism and all of this, but it's not quite so chaotic as Sexing the Cherry. Like it's you still feel like you're following an actual story rather than feeling like you're in some sort of fever dream that you've got no idea what's going on. I think there will be some people that find this offensive because of how the trans main character is used. I'm finding it really hard to judge because on the one hand there was parts of me thinking I think people are going to take offence to this and they're going to say that suggesting that changing your body in that way is in some way similar to like cryogenics, and because it's Frankenstein there's also these allusions to stealing parts of dead people to create a monster, well, to create new life. And so there was part of me that was thinking that could be offensive as I was reading it. But the thing is, what Jeanette Winterson is doing is she's questioning all these conversations. So you have things about animal testing and human testing in there. You have these conversations about gender and change and altering your appearance and your physiology. She's questioning AI and the use of robotics. So one of the main characters, Ron Lord, creates sex bots. So there's like questioning over the use of robots in daily life. You have elements of Ada Lovelace creating a machine that will emulate the human brain. You have Mary Shelley and her creation of Frankenstein. There's just so many elements, and it's just a questioning of that whole thing of tampering with life. Oh, and of course religion. I can't believe I forgot religion. So obviously religion is a big thing in society, and so that's another sort of theme that gets woven into these questions of how we play with life. And one of our characters in there who is religious, and how she changes her mind and is like, oh no, well I think God will be okay with this, but I don't think he'd be okay with this, and I think this is okay because of what it says here in the Bible. And yeah, so there's just so many questions. And then just going back to that topic of whether it's offensive to transgender people, I mean, I'm not transgender. I don't know if I were whether it would be offensive, but I think that actually it was done very well. And because we're from the point of view of a transgender character, we're living their narrative. She's actually very sort of sympathetic, and there's some interesting conversations. I would say, like, I don't know from there's no like author's note on it, but I would say she has done her research on the lived experience of taking hormones and, say, having partial surgery, because of the sorts of things that are said in it about going from living in a body. I can't remember what the exact quote is, but at the end it talks about how you go from living in a body where your brain doesn't feel like the body is right, to taking all these taking in all these chemicals and having corrective surgery so that your brain feels like it's in the correct body, but your body is chemically fighting itself. And it talks about how people who are taking these hormones are likely to get ill earlier on in life and have their body degenerate earlier. And so there's like some interesting things there which I didn't know, and I mean I haven't looked up, so I don't know if they are correct or not. I mean, from my position of not really knowing very much, I feel like it was handled quite well.
Hello, I just wanted to come in and say that I have since done a bit of research and like looked up some articles about whether this might be construed as transphobic. And I'm going to link in the description a really interesting article that I came across on the alluviumjournal.org, which is by Kit Schuster. So Kit Schuster is a graduate student completing an MA in British and North American Cultural Studies at the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg, Germany. Their current research focuses on embodiment, post-humanism, and Gothic literature with an emphasis on queerness and othering. They're a published poet and an activist engaging in community efforts on behalf of LGBTQ+ students. So I feel like I trust this article, and by article I mean it's got quite an academic one, so it really does quote various things, and it's very interesting. And where I was worried that it would be actually transphobic, it turns out that my impression of it being more of a discussion about fetishization of transgender bodies, and the fact that Rye is having these discussions with somebody who fetishizes his body, and then Ron Lord, who basically completely doesn't understand the idea of gender, and he's like, oh well, if you have a penis you're a man, if you don't you're a woman. Like, those conversations are there for a reason. And there's an interesting quote from a 1993 performance piece by someone called Susan Stryker. It was entitled My Words to Victor Frankissstein above the village of Chamonix, performing transgender rage, in which she explicitly links Shelley's creation to the experience of trans women, stating, I find a deep affinity between myself as a transsexual woman and the monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Like the monster, I am too often perceived as less than fully human due to the means of my embodiment. Like the monsters as well, my exclusion from human community fuels a deep and abiding rage in me that I, like the monster, direct against the conditions in which I must struggle to exist. So, yeah, I really feel like my gut instinct that these were conversations and sort of themes that Jeanette Winterson was trying to have were correct, and were not in fact transphobic. But I think it's just so worrying when you come across these things, that because that's not my lived experience. You know, I'm not transgender. I am cis and white, and you know, all these things that mean that I don't have these experiences. There is that worry that my interpretation is not correct. But having read this article and sort of looked at some other things, but this one I think is the most helpful. So this is the one I'm going to link in the description. This is I was right, and Frankissstein is remaining a very happy first place on my list. But yeah, I flipping love this book. So I'm excited to see some more Jeanette Winterson, as the three I've read have been pretty blooming good. See you next time.